people who are most powerful, namely Stoic and Gobber, pretty much don't trust Mildew anyway. This scene is also pretty funny because of I think the whole bit with Snotlout's castle and saying, I need a queen, and Astrid just about vomiting at the thought. Fishleg's joke about the odds of them finding the evidence are about as good as Astrid and Snotlout, and then Astrid cuts him off saying, don't go there, and he sort of gets very meek and says, going nowhere. The dynamic between the three of them just works very well there. Snotlout finding his first bludgeon is kind of fun and pays off later when he tries to very ineffectively bludgeon Alvin with it. I think probably the funniest moment in the whole episode is Savage, who's one of the other outcasts, talking about the Dragon Conqueror and saying he's tall, he's huge, he's this strong man, to which Alvin responds, well, then he shouldn't be hard to find. And then we cut to Hiccup. Small, scrawny, teenage Hiccup, and the contrast between what they expect and what Hiccup really is, I think, is both funny and very telling. It underlies this whole theme through the franchise of brains over brawn. Snotlout's bravado and consequent incompetence are really funny throughout the whole episode, especially on the ship when he says, save your cover fire for someone else, and then accidentally fires a catapult into the ocean, and Gobber says, we'll save extra rounds for him. He genuinely does want to help. He wants to be the hero. He's just really bad at it. Alvin's actually got some pretty funny lines. When they're searching through Burke, he is surprised to find the place empty, and so he assumes they're all hiding in a building somewhere. When they come to the door, he says, should we knock? What's the etiquette in these situations? And then proceeds to just kick the door off the hinges and says, that seems about right. And I think that encapsulates his character very well. There's this whole argument of how many hostages do you think a Dragon Conqueror is worth, and then is meant to actually try to respond with actual numbers, 7, 8. I find that really funny. Then again, I'm pretty susceptible to numerical humor generally. Another great line, probably the best line from the twins in the whole episode, is when Alvin is introducing himself to the people of Burke. Most of the people probably know who he is. It makes some sense that the younger generation wouldn't know him, and Hiccup indeed later says he's never heard of him, which gives us actually some idea of when Alvin was cast out, probably before Hiccup and the twins were born. In the midst of this introduction, Alvin says, I earned that name, meaning, of course, the treacherous part of the name. Toughnut says, Alvin, how do you earn that? Which is just hilarious. It's just like the complete missing of the point, and yet it's still funny. And you have to wonder sometimes with the twins whether they really are as dense as they seem or whether they're just doing it to be funny. The scatological humor returns with Alvin's joke to Snotlout when Snotlout attempts to bludgeon him and then just meekly hands him the bludgeon. Alvin says, check your trousers, boy, I think you soiled yourself. I'm not a big fan of scatological humor, but I think it works here. While they're on the ship, headed to Dragon Island, Hiccup's a prisoner and Alvin's talking to him, and Hiccup is extra snarky. He's actually bordering on dangerously arrogant here. I suppose partly because he succeeded in tricking Alvin to taking him right where he wants to go, but also because he genuinely hasn't heard of Alvin. It seems like Stoic actually never told him about Alvin, which is surprising given that Stoic's expecting him to take over someday. He would need to know who the island's enemies are, but it makes for a great conversation of Alvin being genuinely hurt and disappointed that he doesn't have enough of a reputation for the supposed Dragon Conqueror to know about him. Hiccup, his whole point is to get Burke to be safe, and he asks Alvin to promise that. Alvin says, on me word, son, which, given that treacherous is literally in his name, one has to be suspicious, and it seems from the expression on Hiccup's face that he is. Meanwhile, there are some really good scenes and exchanges on the ship from Burke that is pursuing Hiccup and Alvin, particularly between Stoic, Astrid, and the twins. Stoic, for the second time in this episode, entrusts Astrid with a very important responsibility. The first time was guarding the elders and the children, and this time it's getting the dragons from Dragon Island to use in the battle against Alvin. This is part of a relationship that I really wish was developed more. We'll see a bit more of it later in the series, but the relationship between Stoic and Astrid, I think, is one of the bigger sources of untapped potential in this whole series, because it's clear she is far more like him than his own son, and that he trusts her, because her getting those dragons is the key to getting Hiccup and Toothless out, and which is the key to winning the battle and them all staying alive. So the fact that he trusts her with such an important responsibility, I think, is very telling. We also see where Stoic's priorities are, and that the twins volunteer to personally kick Alvin's butt, which is of course pure bravado and fun on their part. But what's really telling is Stoic's response. He said, "This isn't about Alvin, this is about Hiccup." That is a really moving moment, because it reveals that Stoic's first priority is not defeating Alvin, it's getting Hiccup out safely. He's already got his own island taken care of, and now his top priority is his son. In the whole final battle, as we'll talk about a little later, there are a lot of gaps in the action, a lot of places where people hesitate or don't do something when you would think logically they should. Sometimes this is explained like here, where Hiccup says, "Watch and learn," and Alvin's men are totally, first of all, they're terrified of seeing a Night Fury in person, which makes sense. This is a dragon that's unknown and that was supposedly the most dangerous thing in the world. Here it is, face to face, the first time any of them have seen one. Hiccup is just walking up to it. They are both frightened and shocked that Hiccup is not immediately incinerated or eaten, and then even more shocked that Hiccup gets on the back of what from their perspective is a demonic creature and rides it like a horse. So their shock, I think, makes sense. Alvin is the least shocked, which again shows his adaptability, which I think is a great characteristic of his. Astrid has what I think may be the best low-key funny moment in the episode. When Hiccup gets on Toothless and flies up into the air, Astrid and the other riders meet him, and she asks him, "Did you miss me?" in a way that suggests she's sort of gently teasing him and perhaps even flirting. And if that's the case, she has not the best timing for flirting, because they are literally in the middle of a battle for their lives. But that's not the last time she will do that. So clearly she sees combat as an appropriate time to flirt with Hiccup, which at least it's consistent and pretty funny. There's some interesting quote-unquote camera work during this final battle scene, and I put camera in quotes because of course there's no real camera, it's just all CGI, but some point of view shots. There's one in particular where I can't remember who's firing, but there's arrows being shot at, I think it's Alvin's ship. They miss their target, but we follow them in their perspective, which is really interesting. We sort of fly across the deck of a ship from an arrow's point of view, which is a nice bit of camera work. The moment where Snotlout accidentally figures out the tactic for winning the battle, he misunderstands a command to hold your fire as just fire, and Hookfang fires but hits the water and creates this cloud of steam, which gives them an idea. They can't fire at the ship directly because Astrid's on board, they don't want to hurt her, but they can fire at the water, creating this cloud of steam, which is effectively a camouflage for them and works very well. So first of all, that entire tactic is a great idea, and just the concept of Snotlout accidentally discovering something really useful works well, because it allows him to do something while still keeping his character and relative incompetence so far intact. The fact that Alvin realizes if we can get that boy, we'll ride dragons too, again shows his adaptability. He's actually a very intelligent character. Instead of being shocked and stunned like the rest of his men, he immediately sees an opportunity here. The bond between Hiccup and Toothless is on full display here and done very well, where Stoic asks him, "What were you thinking?" Meaning, what were you thinking in trying to get to this island with Alvin? And Hiccup says, "I just knew if I could get to Toothless, together we'd find a way to make things right." Which both shows how strong his bond with Toothless is, and as will come up later in the franchise, maybe he's a little bit too dependent on Toothless for his own good. The triumphant return, especially the triumphant music playing, that's something the Critical Canucks really appreciated. All of that is really well done. The music, the camera work, and the, of course, final encounter, as we've said, between Hiccup, Stoic, and Mildew. And the final lesson is that the dragons have well and truly earned the trust of the rest of Berk, because they saved their lives in battle, and Mildew, I think, has finally fully lost credibility, even with those who formerly might have supported him. Whatever else the dragons did, They sided with them in battle. They defeated an enemy, and they saved the lives of their chief and of their friends. Fritsch's big blog also praises the action scenes and Alvin as a villain. Another thing that Fritsch points out, which I think I didn't really pay much attention to the first time I saw this episode, but is really important, is that this is one of the few episodes in this first season, and certainly this early on, where Stoic really has a prominent role beyond just being the chief. That he is a father, he is a good tactician, and he really has a personality and a prominence here that I think works well, and he's very well used in this episode because he wants to protect his son. He devises a successful strategy for defeating Alvin and rescuing the hostages. Really shows that he is a good tactician, a good chief, and a loving father, and also knows who to trust. And overall, as Fritsch points out, this episode is satisfying. It has a complete arc on its own. Well, at least the two-parter has a complete arc and sets up Alvin and the Outcasts for future episodes, as well as this wider world for Burke to interact with. Geek Reviews, Ian and Rebecca also agree this is the first really good episode of the season, and they also agree that Stoic, well, in addition to Stoic having a prominent role in the plot, he gets actual fight scenes. He goes hand-to-hand with Alvin at the very end, and in what is in some ways a pretty inventive scene, and he just flat out tries to kill Alvin. He nearly drowns him by dragging him into the ocean from the ship's anchor and broken bow figure. Now Alvin escapes, which again sets up things nicely for the future. They think this fight scene should have been longer. I'm okay with it as it is. This is also the first time that we've seen dragons used in combat against other people, something that will occur more often as the series goes on. In the first movie, we saw them in combat against other dragons, against specifically the Red Death. But this is the first time they've been ridden into battle against other people, Alvin and the Outcasts here. In addition to Fishlegs screaming, his poetry for Meatlug is fun. Something that several critics said of earlier episodes was the fire animation was really poor, and it's significantly improved in this episode. Ian and Rebecca agree with that here, though I guess I hadn't really seen that in earlier episodes. Maybe I just don't have as fine an eye for animation, but I'm glad for any perceived improvement in the animation. The fact that Alvin didn't die at the very end draws some mixed opinions. On the one hand, he probably should have given the position he was in. On the other hand, his hands weren't actually tied. Stoic had just wrapped a rope around them, so it's conceivable he could have gotten free, especially if he's a good swimmer, which again would make sense. On the other hand, it's a good thing because it leaves him available for future episodes, which will use him quite well. That's it for the good, at least that I and others have found, and there's a lot of good in this episode. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too.
This is bad. This is very bad.
But no episode is perfect, so let's take a look at what's not so good. John and Tyler from Omershada criticized some of the slow motion in the battle scene. I didn't think it was bad. I actually thought it worked well. I do agree that when Hiccup is getting an arrow shot at him in slow motion, his eyes really don't react very much. The rest of his face sort of does, but yeah, his eyes are not animated to show much emotion there, so that's a legitimate criticism. Another criticism from Sam and from several other discussions online is that Hiccup never found proof and Mildew is never actually punished for his crime. On the one hand, that's bad in sort of a universal moral sense. On the other hand, sometimes that's what happens in real life, and I think being honest about that is a good thing. Sometimes there is injustice in the world that isn't corrected, at least not right away, and that is a difficult thing, but something I think that is realistically reflected here. There is a continuity goof. According to the wiki, in the Great Hall scene, at one point, Alvin puts a sword through the dragon figurehead, and later on that sword is missing. Some, including Joshua Bailey at Anime Superhero, have criticized the overall plot in that the idea of framing the dragons for something, distrusting them, kicking them off the island, and then earning that trust back is something that's a little bit overused at this point in the series. And I think, on the one hand, that's a fair point that plot has been recycled a lot. Even in the few episodes, it was the big plot of the first episode, and now we do it again. On the other hand, it makes sense that this would take a while, and it might take several attempts for the people of Berk to finally trust the dragons after 300 years of unremitting warfare. And in fact, in some sense, if we're looking at this from a real-world perspective, it's